Taking the stage now, welcome David Barton.
Thanks, guys. I'm going to start this morning with a Bible verse, and the Bible verse is Proverbs 10:22. Proverbs 10:22 says, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and He adds no sorrow to it." And it's a verse is pretty self-evident, right? God's blessing is something that enriches your life. But I learned a whole lot about blessings through a historical figure named Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush is one of the founding fathers. He signed the Declaration. He ratified the Constitution. John Adams set up all the 250 founding fathers. Benjamin Rush is considered one of the three most notable. According to John Adams, it's George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. He started the first abolition society. He started the Sunday school movement in America. He started the first Bible society in America, started 5 universities, did the first academic education for women, trained the first black physicians. Just unbelievable what the guy did. And we at Wall Builders, we have a collection of about 160,000 documents from Columbus all the way through the Bible that landed on the moon with Apollo 14. And a lot of those original documents include founding father writings, and we have a lot of writings from Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush, I've got his prayer journals, and he's a dedicated, strong Christian guy. And in his prayer journals, as you go through, as a solid Christian, he's just trying to be very grateful to God for the blessings he's enjoyed. And so he just goes through and starts listing these blessings, and they're great. And you go, yeah, that's good, that's good. And he got to one that just really set me back. He said, I thank God for all the times I have not fallen downstairs. And when he got there, run that by me again. That was a strange one. I just ran upstairs and didn't fall, and nobody noticed. And it's because I didn't fall. Some of the greatest blessings we have in life are things we don't even notice. If you drive to the store and you don't have a wreck, when you go to the store and back, you don't notice it. If you have a wreck, you notice it. That's not the blessing. But it's like we take our health for granted until something happens, or our family till something happens, or our country till something happens. And I would argue that Americans have more blessings they take for granted than any other people on the face of the earth. There's more that we're not aware of. One example is even our form of government, because there's been 5,800 years recorded history. There's 5,800 years of nations, 5,800 years of constitutions. Cornell University Law School asked a simple question. They said, what is the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? And there's 193 nations today, and they went back and looked at all of it. And what they found was that in those 193 nations we have today, and then all the thousands we've had historically, that the average length of a constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. That's what it averages. Last September the 17th, we had 234 years. There's nobody in the history of the world that's ever come close to that number, and we just don't even appreciate how special that is. We're willing to throw it over. We've got 75% of college students right now who want to get rid of the system, go to socialism. 48% of millennials want to get rid of the system, go to socialism. So we have a blessing that we just take for granted. We don't understand how special we are. And it's not only with our longevity, but it's things even like our creativity. We measure creativity in several ways. You have international copyright, patent protection. So we can measure nation to nation. America is 4% of the world's population. And 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever, but that's not the way it is. Our 4% of the world's population has produced 96% of the inventions in the world. Our 4%. We're surrounded with technology and things that we just assume everybody else has got, and they're not even close to that. Same even with our prosperity. Our 4% of the world's population, every year we produce 23, 24, 25% of the world's gross domestic product. We have a census required by the Constitution every 10 years. Our most recent census, 2020, that released results in 2021. If you live in poverty in America, according to the census numbers, if you live in poverty in America, your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Europe. So the low among us are higher than the second wealthiest place on the face of the earth. See, this is something we don't understand. You go, wow, this is really quite unique. It's called American exceptionalism. This is a term that was given us by Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville when he came here in 1831, wrote the book in 1834, Democracy in America. He said the condition of the Americans is quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar position. Now, this exceptionalism, we're different from other nations, and that's just indisputable. That's not arrogance, that's not cockiness, that's not look at us, we're different. And by the way, exceptional means we're the exception, not the rule. It's not like saying, hey, aren't we exceptional, we're proud, we're bragging. That's not it. We are the exception, we're not the rule. We're different from other nations in so many ways. And who are the leaders responsible for that? Well, invariably, we would look at the people who gave us, like, our Constitution. Look at the Founding Fathers. Look at people like George Washington, people like John Adams, or John Hancock, and people like John Adams. People like that, we say, these are the founders. These are the guys who laid it out. These are the guys who made us exceptional. And that's a logical approach. But what I really like is John Adams in 1816 was approached by a young man named Hezekiah Niles. Hezekiah Niles was a millennial of that generation. He was a young man. He says, he told Adams, he says, I'm writing a book on the history of American, and you were part of that. And by the way, the book came out in 1822. This is an 1816 letter. The book was called Principles and Acts of the American Revolution. We have that book when it came out. But here's this young man who did not go through the American War for Independence, did not go through all the struggles the Founding Fathers did, and he's writing an old Founding Father some 40 years after the Declaration of Independence. He said, we really enjoy what we have in America. I wasn't there to see how it happened. You were. So I'm asking you, who do you think is responsible for what we enjoy in America today? And when John Adams was asked, who do you consider the most influential people? Who influenced your thinking? Who caused you to do what you did? John Adams started listing pastors. He said, right up top, you got the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, and you got the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, and of course there's the Reverend George Whitfield, and you got the Reverend Charles Johnson. He starts going through and listing pastors. Now, these are not the guys that we know much about today. Probably we know something about Whitfield, but the chances that we can do any talking about Mayhew or Cooper or Chauncey, slim to none. And we don't talk about pastors whether they're white or they're black. Like, who in the world is Richard Allen, or who's Absalom Jones, or who's John Moran, or Lemuel Haynes, or who's Harry Hoosier? We don't know these guys. And see, these are the guys that Adams points to. These pastors said, this is where we got our ideas. This is what built America. If you want to celebrate what America became, celebrate this. And let me just give you an example. You take Harry Hoosier, this guy we don't talk much about today, but Harry Hoosier is part of the Great Awakenings. And back in the Great Awakenings, you had these great names like John Wesley and Charles Wesley, and you had George Whitfield, you had Francis Asbury, all these famous guys. And it's interesting, as big as the crowds were that they drew, and there were tens of thousands that would come to these open cow pastures to hear these guys talk. It's interesting that Francis Asbury said that Harry Hoosier drew larger crowds than they did. He got the biggest crowds. And Benjamin Rush, who's the signer of the Declaration we just talked about, Benjamin Rush said, I've attended his meetings. He said, he's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Benjamin, you've been running around with Patrick Henry and all these other great orators. Yeah, but nobody's as good as Harry. And Harry's ministry was largely what we would call blue-collar kind of folks. The folks that he ministered to were rough and tumble guys, particularly frontier guys. They were woodsmen, and they had a rough and tumble life. I mean, they cussed a lot, and they fought a lot, they drank a lot, they got converted, and once they got converted, they didn't fight as much or cuss as much or drink as much. And these are the guys that he really had a ministry to, and they really came to him, they really liked him. And it's interesting that his ministry was largely along the East Coast. And along that East Coast, he would be in Philadelphia, and he would be in Delaware, and he'd be in Jersey. And these guys would come. And what's interesting is America started growing up over the next several years. As America started moving west, you get out in the Western Territory, these are the guys that went west with America, because they are the woodsmen and the explorers and the hunters, and they were what were called the long hunters. They would go out deer hunting and come back 8 months later having found 3 states. I mean, this is what they did. This is what they liked doing. And so as America starts moving west, these guys went with it. And as they got out west, a bunch of the other explorers that were the rough and tumble guys would look at the converts and say, these guys are really different. What's up with them? And the answer was, they're a bunch of those Hoosiers. It was the Indiana Territory at the time. They're Hoosiers with the converts of Harry Hoosier. Now, it's interesting. I wonder how many people who live in Indiana know that they were named after a black evangelist. Probably very few. Now, see, you would think that if a guy has a state named after him, he might show up in somebody's history book somewhere. See, this is part of what we have in America. We don't know our own history well. We particularly don't know our religious history well, and we especially don't know our black history well. Do you know, 30 years ago, we weren't teaching critical race theory in schools because we knew too much of our own history to teach that. But now that we don't know that, and we don't know those black pastors like Lemuel Haynes and John Morant and the others at Harry Hoosier, we don't know that. Now we're into buying things about us that aren't even true because, and again, this is why we own 160,000 of these original documents. We can show you this stuff. And so as you look at the impact of pastors, it's really significant. Going back to John Adams, he points to these pastors. Why would John Adams point to pastors to say these are the guys responsible for what we are in America? It's because historians even today have documented that if you look at the Declaration of Independence, every single right set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. Let me say that another way. If you want a fun project, why don't you try reading the Declaration of Independence as a listing of sermon topics? Because that's what we were being taught from the pulpit for 15 years before we wrote the document. So the ideas, all those ideas in the Declaration came from the pulpit, documented 15 years. We've been preaching that before the Founding Fathers wrote it down, which is why John Adams points back and says, this is where we got our ideas. This is who influenced me. So John Adams talked about the fact that the pulpits had thundered. That was his phrase. The pulpits had thundered, and it's easy to document that. We own thousands and thousands of sermons from back in that era. I'm an ordained minister. I've been on a number of church staffs in a number of states in different positions. And it's interesting to me to see these sermons and read them because they're like nothing that I've ever taught before when I was teaching in the pulpit. They're like nothing I really hear today. And they address biblical relevancy at a level that we just don't often think about it anymore. I think we've been, in Romans 12, 1 and 2, King James, be not conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But in the Phillips translation, I love it. It says, don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. In many ways, the church has kind of taken, well, here's the secular stuff. We'll take care of that. You guys do the spiritual stuff. And so we address the spiritual things without realizing the secular things are also spiritual things because God's word applies to every aspect of life. It applies to everything related to life and godliness. And so we've been talked out of talking about a lot of things that we would normally talk about and give you examples of sermons. Let me take you back to this sermon. And most of these sermons you're going to see are revival sermons. They're Great Awakening sermons. This is a sermon preached in 1755. You can see the discourse, Revelation 15. It's occasioned by the earthquakes in November 1755. Now, this is preached by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. This is one of the guys that Sam Adams particularly talked about, said he's the guy that shaped our thinking. What you have is you have an earthquake, and earthquakes in the news, and their thinking was whatever is being covered in the news, we need to show how the Bible applies to every aspect of life. So since earthquakes aren't common in Boston, and that's what everybody's talking about because we just had one this week, let's talk about earthquakes. Now, I thought about that and thought, if I had to do a sermon on earthquakes, many times I've read through the Bible, hopefully everybody reads the Bible at least once a year, cover to cover. You go through the Bible, you say, okay, there's an earthquake with King Uzziah. Amos talks about an earthquake. There's an earthquake when Jesus is crucified, earthquake when Jesus is resurrected. All right, I've got it. There's earthquakes in the Bible. I can do a good 20, 30-minute sermon on what the Bible says about earthquakes. If you will notice, this is a 5-week sermon on earthquakes. I can't come anywhere close to 5 weeks on earthquakes. And I went recently online, just looked for earthquakes in the Bible. I was shocked at dozens of verses documenting earthquakes in the Bible. I've just never noticed that. I'm not trained to look for practical things like they look for. Whatever came up in life. So whether it was fires or floods, whatever natural disaster, you'll find lots of sermons on those. This is a sermon on comets, and you see at the bottom it's 2 sermons on comets. What verse would you use on that? But see, they were into astronomy. So we have sermons on solar eclipses and lunar eclipses and discoveries of planets and all sorts of things. There's so much in the Bible and astronomy, which is why so many of the early astronomers were theologians. That's part of what they did. They found so much in the Bible, and that's where they got into astronomy. And here's a sermon on the infirmities and comforts of old age, which is probably not a super popular topic, but it's definitely a very practical topic. Everybody's got to deal with aging, and everybody's got to deal with those who are aging. So what kind of guidance do you have? See, this is the really practical stuff that they hit. This is a sermon on religion and patriotism, the constituents of a good soldier. It's a military sermon. This is actually a deployment sermon. This is preached by the Reverend Samuel Davies, one of the great awakening preachers. And so much in the Bible on military. I mean, even John the Baptist, when he's baptizing people, has specific instructions for officers and for soldiers. The Bible's full of military guidance, and so that's where we got a lot of the guidance. In the same way, this is a sermon on the relation of the medical profession to the ministry. It's a sermon on health care. And this is a good example of remembering some specific things back. Now, let me take you back to Abraham. Early part of Genesis, we get introduced to Abraham and his lineage. You have Abraham, then you have Isaac and Jacob. And we know that Jacob married Rachel and Leah, and they had the 12 sons. And out of the 12 sons, probably the most famous son, the son that gets the most attention in the Bible, is Joseph. And so Joseph is sold into slavery. He's out of their hair. As far as they're concerned, he's dead. And then he ends up in Egypt. And Egypt, God raises him up, becomes the second in Egypt. And then this big famine hits. And because of the famine, the brothers and family said, man, we're starving to death. Go to Egypt, see if you can get us something. And so when they get there, eventually they get reunited and find out, oh, he's not dead. We thought he was dead. Here's our brother. And he says, how's Dad doing? And so he gets to see Dad and goes back to Dad and said, hey, just come live with us in Egypt because we got everything there. I've got a good position there. And so the family packs up and they move to Egypt. And it works out really well for them until they get into slavery. And then they get into slavery and they spend 400 years in slavery. And after 400 years of slavery, God says, I've had enough of this. And so he sends Charlton Heston to deliver them from slavery. And then, sends Moses to deliver them from slavery. And you remember how it goes. There's the 10 plagues, the 10 great miracles that God performs. He wipes out the Egyptians at the Red Sea. And then he leads them with a pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. And he gets them out there to the mountain. And when he gets them out to the mountain, it's really significant. Understand what's going on here. These are people who have been in slavery for 400 years. The problem with being in slavery for 400 years is you think like a slave, you act like a slave, you react like a slave, everything. This is the way you've thought for 400 years. He says, guys, I'm going to make a nation out of you. I'm going to make the most preeminent nation in the ancient world. You're going to be those people. And you got to change the way you think. So he stops at the mountain. He says, I got your complete attention. Nobody's chasing you, and you don't have a clue where you're going. So I've got your full attention. And he proceeds to deliver to them 613 different laws. We talk about the 10 Commandments, which is the essence. In Exodus 23, he says, this is the tenor of my laws. This is the heart, the soul, the backbone, the chief skeleton. But there's 613 laws, and they deal with every conceivable subject any nation will ever have to deal with. And when it got time to go in the promised land, they were still thinking like slaves. So he said, this generation is not going to make it. We've got to have the next generation. You guys didn't get your thinking cleaned up good enough to go in the promised land. Let the next generation do it. So the next generation comes in, and they put these laws into effect. And they deal with every consanguinity and due process and anything you can think of, including health care. And significantly, in 1961, a medical doctor came out with a book called None of These Diseases. That's based on Exodus 15:26, where God says, if you will follow all of the health care laws I gave you, if you'll do everything I just told you, I won't put on you any of the diseases that I put on the Egyptians. You'll have a different life if you'll follow my health code. And so this medical doctor in 61 says, when God came out with this health code, all the advanced nations of the time, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and Egyptians, laughed at the Israelites and said, what a bunch of backward people. Look at their health code. We know how health codes work, and these guys don't have a clue. He says, now here we are several thousand years later, and it turns out that we now have dozens of medical studies for every single health provision in the Bible, and it turns out the Bible is far ahead of all science at the time. And so he just goes through and lists the health care provisions of the Bible and how they work, and boy, monkeypox and the things that are going right now, that is so easy to take back to specific things that God said in the Old Testament, specifically in that health code, what's going on. I mean, I'm not going to get into the relevancy. I need to keep moving, but nonetheless, there's so much there, and that's why we had sermons on things like healthcare, because the Bible deals with every aspect of life in the same way it deals with economics. There's a sermon on the character and tendencies of the property tax, system of taxation, Reverend Glover. Economics? Yep. The Bible covers minimum wage, Matthew 20:15. It covers the capital gains tax, Luke 19, Matthew 25. It covers the estate tax. It covers the inheritance tax. It covers capitation taxes, covers progressive taxes, covers flat taxes. Matter of fact, even Jesus and Peter got in a conversation where Jesus said to Peter, Peter, who pays the taxes of the nation? Is it the citizens or is it the foreigners? Peter laughed and said, everybody knows that. Citizens don't pay taxes in the nation. It's the foreigners that pay taxes. Really? How's that worked out for America? It's interesting. Citizens pay a lot of taxes now, but we had to amend the Constitution to do that. See, prior to 1913, the 16th Amendment, you could not directly tax the people. you just wasn't done. We had to change the Constitution. When progressives got it, we don't even recognize the fact that Jesus has tax policies throughout, and he and Peter even cover that, and it's like a joke to Peter. Of course the citizens don't pay taxes, the foreigners, and that's what we did. Excise and tariffs and imports, all the different taxes. That's where, for years, that's where the income came from in American taxation system. So we had sermons on economics. We had sermons. This is a sermon. You see, it's 1751. This is another Great Awakening sermon. Again, most of these sermons are either from the first or the second Great Awakening, and you'll find that revivals are when you make God's word practical to a people. People start wanting how to live my faith, how to live out in a crazy time like this. This is when revivals occur, and it's not because we have come to Jesus moments, which are needed. It's because we have discipleship moments. Jesus said, make not converts of all men, make disciples of all men. And so we've got to get the converts made, but once we get a convert, we've got to make a disciple out of them. We have to show them how to think and act in every single aspect of life. And so this one is preaching from the legislature of Virginia, 1751, and it's a sermon on the sinfulness and pernicious nature of gaming. Now, 95% of Christians today cannot name a single Bible verse that deals with gambling, lottery, anything else. But this is what we had sermons on, even in front of legislatures back then. This is a sermon. It's called A Good Sermon. It's a good law. It's a sermon, the liquor law of Massachusetts. This is 1852. What happened was the previous week, the legislature passed a law. Pastor said on Sunday, here's what the legislature did this week. Let's see how it lines up. They took the law. They took the Bible, said, this is actually a good law. They did exactly what the Bible said you should do on this topic, and that's why it's called a good law, because we're looking at the policy that was done this week in the legislature. Let's see if they got it right. In the same way, this is a sermon on the injustice and policies of slave trade. It was the church that led the way on equality and understanding that slavery is not right. Whether you go to what Jesus said in Luke 4, quoting from Isaiah 63, what you have in Galatians, all the other passages, it was the church that led the way all the way through that issue. We have the same when you get to this one. This is a sermon out of New Hampshire, 1837. It's a sermon, and it says there in small print, on occasion of the new law of marriage coming into operation. Same thing again. The legislature this week passed a law dealing with marriage. Here's what the legislature said. Here's what the Bible says. Based on what the Bible says, that's an acceptable law. The legislature did okay because here's what the Bible says on that policy. We had it on the other side as well. This is called the higher law, application of the Fugitive Slave Bill, a sermon 1850. Have a stack of these sermons on the Fugitive Slave Bill. 1850, out of the hundreds, out of the millions of federal laws that have been passed, this is hands down one of the three most wicked federal laws ever passed in American history, the Fugitive Slave Law. And when that slave law came out, it was passed in 1850, went into effect in 1851. When it came out, all over the United States, sermons were preached saying, okay, guys, here's what Congress just did. Here's the law they just passed. Here's what God says about that issue. Are you listening to me? This is what they do in the sermon. Are you listening to me? Full attention. If you obey the federal law, you are disobeying God's law. If you're going to obey God's law, you have to disobey the federal law. Now, that was going on across. Nobody likes calling for civil disobedience, but the Bible is full of that. As a matter of fact, Hebrews 11 is full of that. So many of our heroes in our faith, whether it be the Hebrew midwives or Daniel or the three Hebrew children, nobody's looking to disobey and be anarchists. Nobody's wanting that. But there are times where you have to say, here's what the Bible says, here's what the Congress said, and Congress is wrong. And so this led to two things in America. This is what started the Underground Railroad in America. It was the Fugitive Slave Law, and it was the church who started the Underground Railroad. The second thing that happened is what's called jury nullification. Across the United States, when someone was accused under the Fugitive Slave Law and was put in front of a jury, the jury said, you're not guilty, because if we convict you, that's an injustice, because the law is so bad that for us to convict you under a bad law would be injustice itself, and we're not doing it. So jury nullification and the Underground Railroad came from these sermons back in 1850, 1851. So social policy was something we covered a lot of back then. Again, whatever was in the news, and that's what John Adams said, our pulpits have thundered. Here's a sermon on the cry of Sodom inquired into. It's a sermon on homosexuality, LGBTQ, and this is something where the church really has gone silent. We do a lot of polling nationally, do a lot of stuff with George Barna. Just had a huge poll came out a week and a half ago with George Barna. And what we find right now is 77% of Christians self-censor on this issue because they know that if they speak out on this issue, they're going to get attacked, they're going to get deplatformed or thrown in Facebook jail, or they're going to get doxxed, or somebody's going to get upset with them, and they just don't want that kind of grief, so they just stay silent. So we've gone silent on an issue, which is not a good deal, because the Bible says one side sounds good until you hear the other, and right now kids are getting one side and they're not getting the other, and we're not speaking out about that because it's a tough issue. There's just a lot of grief that'll happen if you speak out about that issue. It was a tough issue back then. There's just no way around that. Nobody liked to talk about it. This is an election sermon. This deals with voting and government and elections. Matter of fact, not only elections, even candidates. This is a sermon preached in 1800 by Tunis Wortman, and it's on the election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. He said, guys, there is no way in this world you can vote for Thomas Jefferson because he is so ungodly, and it goes through. Well, it's interesting. That's a sermon preached out of the pulpit in 1800. Here's another sermon preached out of the pulpit in 1800. It says Thomas Jefferson is absolutely the guy that God has raised up. You got to vote for Thomas Jefferson. So even in the pulpit, we had this kind of stuff. But that's not the point. The point is we had no compunction at all about addressing anything in the news that was going on. Even if we had disagreements among ourselves, which we're going to. I mean, it's just part of, if you're a Protestant, it's based on the root word protest. So we kind of disagree with everybody on everything. That's what makes the Protestant church. And so having sermons like this is not unusual. So even on politics, but we think, we really can't do that today. Well, go back to the Bible and notice how the office of a prophet was to talk to civil leaders and confront them on civil policy. Whether it is Isaiah with Hezekiah on what he did with letting the Assyrians see the temple and everything that was in it, or whether it is Elijah confronting Ahab and Jezebel and said, you guys are responsible for 3.5 years of drought in this country. It's because of what you guys have done with the religious persecution. You persecuted the Lord's prophets, and on top of that, you've been suborning. You have eminent vain, what you did with Naboth to take his vineyard, and you suborned perjury to get that. He went through and listed. He, to their face, called them out for this. And this is common for what happened throughout the Scriptures. There's no indication in the Scriptures of God's leaders being silent to civil authority when they were off base or when they were on base. They also told them when they did the right things. So this is real common. But today we've turned silent on that because we're told the Johnson Amendment. And I'll point out that the Johnson Amendment, for all practical purposes, does not exist legally. For 10 years, been working with groups like Alliance Defending Freedom, trying to get pastors sued on this. We've turned in more than 8,500 pastors who deliberately baited the IRS to get a suit on this because we know we can win it constitutionally. I've been involved in 13 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, involved in a case this year, already involved in a case next year at the Supreme Court. We know this is a winnable thing. You all understand that unions are really politically involved, right? You do know that a union is a nonprofit as well? So how come a union can be politically involved and a church can't be politically involved? Because they're both nonprofits. See, we're tied our own hands and said, hit me in the face. Punch me in the face again. It feels really good. We have tied our hands in the culture and given the other side full reign. And so when President Trump got into 2017, he ordered the IRS not to enforce the Johnson Amendment because it's unconstitutional. And it's interesting, of all the things that Biden has reversed in his administration, he's not reversed that policy. That policy is still there. The IRS is not going to enforce it. Now, they've hired 87,000 new agents. We'll see what they're enforcing now. But nonetheless, we still got law groups everywhere. They're looking for a case on this because it's an easy win in the Supreme Court. We shouldn't be tying our hands, especially when historically and biblically they're not to be tied, much less legally. So when you look at all these sermons, this is what I talk about biblical relevancy. And we've got about 260 of these sermons up on the website at Wall Builders, and we have thousands and thousands of those old sermons. It's amazing just to read through and see what they dealt with. What we have a problem with today, current polling that's come out right now, is only 9% of Christians read the Bible on a daily basis. Now that's Christians. And by the way, if you saw the State of the Bible report from the American Bible Society that came out this year, 2022 report, and the American Bible Society, by the way, was started in 1816 by founding fathers. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, signer of the Constitution. John Langdon, signer of the Constitution. John Quincy Adams, President of the United States. These are the guys that started the American Bible Society. American Bible Society reported this year that we have dropped another 26 million Americans last year who stopped reading the Bible. So Bible reading is on its way down in America. That's why Bible relevancy is on its way down in America. Most folks do not read the Bible anymore. We don't understand how it applies to economics or due process or anything else. So in addition to that, that's why right now only 6% have a biblical worldview. Only 1 out of 16 Christians can apply Bible verses to specific things that are in the news. And again, the practice back then was whatever the headline of the news is, let's show how the Bible applies to the headline of the news. Today, only 2.8% of pastors, we did massive polling with George Barton that there's 384,000 senior pastors in America, churches, senior pastors calling 500 a day, find that only 2.8% of pastors address current issues that are in the news, that are also in the Bible. So we're not doing a good job on biblical relevancy, and that's why we're seeing the drop we are in America. You look back in the year 2000, at that point in time, 85% of Americans professed to be Christians. In the year 2020, 20 years later, it was down to 65%. We've had a 20% drop in 20 years. And in asking people, why did you stop going to church? Why did you leave the church? 2 out of 3 people said because it lacked biblical relevancy. That's what people are hungry for. They're looking for something that will apply and make their faith relevant, not just theoretical faith, not just historic faith, but faith that works right now. So this is why we see a cry in America for we got to have revivals. We're praying for revival. We need a revival, and that's a great prayer. I've been involved in a lot of those big meetings. I remember Governor Rick Perry had 100,000 people at the stadium in Houston praying and fasting on a Saturday to have a revival in the nation. That's gone with a lot of people across the nation. There's a lot going on. But I think the major problem we have with that is we don't understand what a revival looks like historically. We have an obsession really with a national focus. We're looking for a national revival. And that's never the way revivals occur. That's never the way change occurs. It doesn't happen nationally. Let me explain part of why we have this focus. When you look at people now, they get their news from somewhere. Everybody gets it, and if you're on the right, you probably listen to Fox, although fewer people listen to Fox or Epic Times or Blaze or Victory News, something on the right. If you're on the left, it's going to be CNN or MSNBC or whatever it is. Doesn't matter. Everybody gets a heavy dose of national news. As a result of that, I can walk into any group and say, okay, I want you guys to name 3 federal legislators, House, Senate. Everybody can quickly do that. I say, name 3 of your local legislators. I want to hear 3 of your city council members, 3 of your school board members. Can't do that. We can tell you what's happening nationally. We don't know what's happening around us very well. In the same way, when you look at the Supreme Court, we're quite aware of what's happening at the Supreme Court. We're not very aware of what's happening with state judges or local judges or county judges or city judges. In the same way, we know about the president. We can tell you all about President Biden, what's happening there. And yet, if I say, who's the president of your local school board, most folks don't have a clue. We have more ability to change what's going on around us than we do nationally. And I don't say that lightly. I'm very involved nationally. I have dozens and dozens and dozens of friends in Congress, House and Senate, got connections, Supreme Court, everything else. And this even goes back to something that happened last August when President Biden said we're going to be out of Afghanistan by the end of August. Back in December of 2015, Glenn Beck started something called the Nazarene Fund. We saw ISIS move into the Middle East and start setting up the caliphate, and they were murdering Christians at high rates. We went from 2.5 million Christians in the Middle East down to less than 200,000. It looked like Christianity was going to be extinguished, and as that was just starting, Glenn said, we got to save Christians. So Glenn and I help. I run Glenn's nonprofits for him, and so Glenn Beck and I, we've got the Nazarene Fund. And so we got involved, and we were able to save hundreds of thousands of Christians out of the Middle East. We were able to send them to Australia. We had good connections with Australia. We had connections with, we sent them to Slovakia, to Brazil, to Canada, all over. We weren't allowed to send them to the United States. The United States wouldn't take persecuted Christians, so we'd send them across the world. And the guy who runs our operations is one of the top military folks in the world. He was the chief intelligence officer for Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. He's the chief intelligence officer for Secretary of Defense Gates. He was a National Security Council under Trump. He's top intelligence guy, and he runs all of our operations. And so when Biden said we want everybody out of Afghanistan by the end of August, it was bad. And the first week is when you saw women throwing their babies over the razor wire trying to save them, get them to America. the end of that first week, when it was so bad, we got a call from the military. Called our guy and said, hey, would you guys take over civilian evacuations out of Afghanistan? We said, sure, that's what we do. So we stepped in those last 3 weeks, we got thousands and thousands and thousands out. And we got persecuted Christians. We got the P1, P2, SIV, passport guys, the guys that were the American allies fighting with the Americans. Taliban was going door to door. If you were an American ally, if you fought with the Americans, they hung you on the spot. If you were a Christian, they beheaded you and burned your body. So we got all these people going out. And the biggest problem we had, there were 20 different terrorist groups in Afghanistan at the time. And the problem wasn't dealing with the 20 different terrorist groups. It was dealing with the State Department. We had planes in the air, and the State Department would call ahead. We had a plane in the air going to Macedonia, getting Christians to Macedonia, and the State Department called ahead and said, no, turn that plane back. You don't want to accept those. When that plane goes back, ISIS, the terrorists know that if we're taking people out, it's people they're looking for. So when that plane lands back in Afghanistan, guess what happens to people on the plane? And so we had the same thing, Albania. We had planes going to Albania. State Department called and turned them back. And so I just got frustrated, and I said, look, you are the guys who told us to get them out of here, and now you're turning them back, and they're getting killed as a result. What are you doing? And so I called a bunch of senators and congressmen. They got ticked. They called Blinken. I said, what are you doing? Blinken said, I don't know what you're talking about. He found out. He called the State Department Middle East desk and said, what are you guys doing? We told them to get them out of there. What are you and they said, well, we're not going to. We don't think they should be leaving. So, I mean, with all the connections I have in D.C., we couldn't get anything done at all. We actually had to go outside of the State Department and contact over in Pakistan. The Prime Minister of Pakistan interceded with ISIS and the terrorists to allow those people to go out. It wasn't the U.S. So I've got all these federal connections, national connections. How good does that work out? It doesn't work out at all. See, most people have no ability to change anything at the federal level. And we should be focusing on that. We get frustrated with what's going on there. We get angry. We feel paralyzed with what's happening there. And we need to be looking at local level. Let me give you some historical examples to close this out. Look at historical examples. Go to the American War for Independence. If you look at the first 4 battles in the American War for Independence, it's interesting how they all happened. Not anybody in those battles, and we were heavily outnumbered in those battles. Not anybody in those battles contacted George and said, George, you're the national commander-in-chief. You're in charge of all the military. Get us help here. Get it right now because we're really outnumbered. Nobody contacted George because the attitude was, it's our community. We'll take care of it. George, you got really important things at the national level. We'll take care of our communities right here. Don't worry about it. And so if you take the first one, the Battle of Lexington, what happened was on April 19th, 700 British came marching in town. They're on their way to Lexington, or they're on their way to Concord. Lexington's going to try to stop them. And Reverend Jonas Clark brought 73 guys from his church out there to face the 700 British. And so it was a local church saying, no, you're not going to do this in our community. Because what they were doing, they were going into private homes, taking what they wanted, taking stores, taking stuff. And British Bill of Rights said, you can't do that. A man's home is a castle. And they said, no, you're not going to do this. And Pastor Clark had been teaching his congregation. He said, look, there's a lot of conflict going. The British have been shooting at us now for over 5 years. We have not returned fire. And you need to know that we might get into a war. And if that happens, what does the Bible say about war? Well, the Bible says you can't have an offensive war. You can't start anything. Now, if they fire at you, you're allowed the right of self-defense. Exodus 22, twice in Nehemiah, over in Luke. You got all these passages on self-defense, but you can't start anything. And so when they lined up that morning against the British, they said, British, we're not letting you go to Concord. We're stopping you right here. This is our community, and you're just not going to do this. The problem was it turned into a big loss because we're not allowed to shoot until they've shot at us. When you have 700 single-fire muskets shooting at 73 single-fire muskets, it's a lopsided battle, and it was. 18 Americans hit the ground that morning. Not a single British hit the ground that morning. The British marched on through Lexington. They went to Concord. In Concord, we're told that some 300 to 400 courageous Americans faced the British at Concord, wouldn't let them come into town, and again, that's not correct. What happened is Reverend William Emerson took his church out there. Excuse me. Reverend William Emerson had 300 to 400 guys in his church, and they said, no, we're not letting you do this. This is our community, and you're just not going to do this in our community. So they stood up and defended their community, and at that point in time, they said, by the way, did we hear that you fired at our brethren back in Lexington? Is it game on now? Is the war started? Okay, so that's where we fired the first shots were that morning. That's where the first British hit the ground. At that point in time, the British said, you know, this is not going the right direction. We just faced 73 Americans. Now we got 400. There's only 700 of us. We better get back to Boston, get reinforcements real quickly. That's the third battle. That's the battle on the road to Boston. 19-mile running battle between Concord going back to Charleston. Along that way, what they feared is exactly what happened, because there were 4,500 Americans that lined the roads on both sides shooting at the British, because the British were going by burning every home they could, burning fields, destroying all the American stuff they could, and the Americans said, you're just not going to do this. Where did those 4,500 people come from? Well, Reverend Benjamin Balch brought his church over to the road, and so did Payson Phillips. It was, again, local churches, local communities saying, this is our community. You're just not going to do this here. The same when you get to the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was Reverend Joseph Willard said, well, I got two companies here in the church. Let's go get with all the other churches in Boston. We'll defend Boston. That's what the Battle of Bunker Hill was. It was local churches defending their own areas. Now, that's what happens in the Revolution. There's more than 130 battles in the Revolution, and nearly none of them are national battles. Yeah, you had Lexington, you had Brandywine, you had Monmouth. We needed George in critical times, but 95% of what went on were local battles. They're battles you probably haven't even heard about, because they were all fought locally, and that was the attitude. We won a national victory by winning so much local victory that's how we won. And so that national attitude of if you want to win the nation, you win the local battles. It's the same thing that goes on with what we see even in revivals, because we're praying for a national revival. That's not the way revivals happen. You go, no, wait a minute. There's a Great Awakening. Wasn't that a national revival? Yeah, the Great Awakening we would call a national revival, because when you look at George Whitefield, what he did, I mean, think about it. This guy, he had 34 years of preaching in America. He preached 18,000 sermons, and grab this, 80% of all Americans physically heard him preach a sermon. Now, that's message penetration. Anybody in big tech would love to have that kind of message. Twitter, anybody would love to have 80% message penetration. Didn't happen. How did it happen? It's because George Whitefield was the chaplain in Georgia. He got on his horse in Georgia, and he rode all the way to Maine, which was part of Massachusetts back then. That was the northern part of Massachusetts. He went from as far south to as far north as he could go. He stopped in every town he went through and had a revival. When he got to Maine, he turned around and rode back to Georgia, but he took a different route back, and he stopped in all the different towns coming back. When he got to Georgia, he turned around and rode back to Maine, different route, stopped in different towns. He did that 7 times. 34 years, he made 7 trips. The reason 80% of Americans physically heard him preach a sermon is he was in 80% of the towns in America preaching sermons. It wasn't a national revival. It was local revivals all over America that turned into a national revival, and that's what the Second Great Awakening was as well. And so we look at national stuff because we're fixated on national news, and that's just not where you win things. You win them more at the local level. So the obsession we have with national has got to be replaced with local stuff. And this is also where it comes to civic involvement. Let me take you through stats real quickly. To be a voter in America is very easy. All you have to do, 2 things. Constitutionally, you have to be 18 years old and a legal citizen. If you can do that, 100% of 18-year-olds who are legal citizens can vote. The third thing we ask you to do is register to vote. Register to vote, we want to make sure you vote one time, somebody doesn't vote 7 times for you, or you don't vote 7 times or whatever. This is where it starts falling apart. 65.3% of Americans are registered to vote. This means 100 million American adults have said, I'm not going to be part of the process. I don't care where America goes. I'm not going to participate in it. So 100 million American adults that are 18 years old and legal citizens have said, I'm not going to register. That includes 40 million evangelical Christians who have said, I'm not going to register. I'm not going to have any impact in elections at all. Think what America would look like if you had 40 million more players on the field involved in this thing. It's like having a football game, and there's 11 players on the other team, and you got 3 players on your team, and at halftime it's tied. If the rest of our team ever shows up, it's not even going to be close in the second half. And this is where we are. We have a whole lot of our team not on the field. Now, when you look, there's 2 types of elections in America. The one we hear most often about is presidential elections. That's where you have the highest voter turnout. In the last 11 presidential elections, the average voter turnout is 54% of registered voters turn out in presidential elections. Last 11. But that's 54% of registered voters, not of adults. That's 54% of 65.3%, which means 36% of adults vote in presidential elections. It takes half of that to win. The elections we're having this year are called off-year elections. That's when we choose our governors, our senators, our congressmen, our legislators. Average voter turnout is 38%, but that's 38% of registered voters, which is 38% of 65.3%. That puts you down at 26% of American adults who vote for governors and others. It takes half of that to win. So what we're looking at is over the last 11 presidential elections, 1 out of 5 Americans chooses the President of the United States. 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our governors and chooses our senators and our congressmen. And then when it goes to the local level, it drops down to 6%. But that's 6% of 65.3%, which is 4% of adults vote in local elections. It takes half of that to win. Let me give an example right here. Your near neighbor, Los Angeles, Garcetti up in Los Angeles. Los Angeles population is the second largest city in the nation. It's larger than the population of 23 individual states. So Eric Garcetti is like being a governor in 23 states. Garcetti brags about the fact that he was elected mayor of Los Angeles with 2.9% of the vote. That's like being a governor, 2.9%. See, it falls apart when we come to local elections. We're focused on national stuff. We don't do good there, but we do nothing at local level. Well, I can't say we do nothing. I'm talking collectively, figuratively. Most of the church does not get involved there. Take you to Houston, the fourth largest city in the United States. The population of Houston is larger than 20 states. And Houston elected Anise Parker as their mayor. She was elected with 4.9% of the registered voters, which is 3.3% of the adults in Houston voted for her. She's the first open lesbian mayor in Houston's history. When she got elected, she passed what was called HERO, Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, and it said, hey, if you say that marriage between a man and a woman, that is a hate crime, and I've got you. She went after 5 pastors she knew had said that. They're called the Houston Five. She subpoenaed 17 different forms of communication, said, I want to see all your sermon notes, all your text messages, all your emails. I want to see all your social media. I want to hear all your voice messages. I want to see 17 different things. And if you've said marriage between a man and a woman, I have got you. That is a crime in Houston. At that point, we said, I don't think that's why she was elected the mayor. And so we got 4,500 churches involved in Houston. There's tens of thousands of churches in Houston. We got 4,500 involved. So let's have a referendum on this. Got it put on the ballot. And the day before the election, Houston Chronicle ran a poll and said, we're going to lose 60-40. The city is firmly behind her. They agree with this policy. They don't like homophobes. They don't like haters. And they're firmly behind her. Well, the next day we had the election. We had 14% turnout. And we crushed her by 22 points. It was a 61-39. Now, I'll point out a couple of things here. Number one, the polling was off 42 points. They said she's going to win 60-40. She lost 61-39. They said 20-point win. This is a 22-point loss. That's a 42-point miss on the polls. Second thing to point out is, notice the 14%? That is pathetic turnout. Yeah, but that's 5 times higher than what it had been. Just when you get Christians involved just a little bit, it makes an exponential difference in the outcome, just that little bit. If I take you to Fort Worth is the 13th largest city in the United States. 6 years ago, the city of Fort Worth Independent School District said, we've looked at the gender stuff. We're not going to do gender stuff anymore. We're going to let kids in school choose whatever bathrooms they want, whatever locker rooms they want. They can choose whatever showers they want. We're not going to do gender stuff anymore. That got picked up nationally at the time. President Obama, his Secretary of Education, Artie Duncan, said, I should have thought of that. Great idea. He said, here's the new policy. If your public school gets federal dollars, which is 97% of public schools, you're not going to do the gender stuff anymore in your schools. Now, this is disturbing for me because Fort Worth is in my backyard. I'm a cowboy from Texas, and everything that goes with it, the ranch, the cattle, the horses, etc. And if you don't know, the nickname of Fort Worth, we call it Cowtown, USA. And that's what it's called. Twice a day, we shut down North Main Street, and we drive that herd of Longhorns up and down North Main Street twice a day. This is part of Fort Worth heritage. It's who we are. We're called the city where the West begins. Now, you may not be a cowboy. You may not like cowboys. You may not know anything about cowboys. It doesn't matter. I can take any one of you, and I can put any one of you behind that herd, and you can all tell me the genders of every one of those critters behind that herd. It's really, really easy. It takes no special knowledge, no special degree, and we've never seen a bull become a cow. We've never seen a cow become a bull. And it was Fort Worth, Texas, who did this. So I looked in Fort Worth. We have 918,000 there, 13th largest city. And the school board president who came up with this silly policy was elected with less than 1,200 votes. It's 1,182 votes. I looked in the district where he ran and quickly found dozens of evangelical churches that could have easily kept him from being in office. I found one evangelical church that had more than 3,000 registered voters in that church. That one church could have kept him from being on the school board, which would have saved all of America from 6.5 years of gender identity nonsense that we've had. See, it came out of a local area. This local stuff becomes national. This is where it comes from. A couple more quick examples. Bentonville, Arkansas. In Bentonville, Arkansas, a Christian lady there said, and Bentonville's the home of Walmart, by the way, 40,000 people in Bentonville. A Christian lady said, not doing this, I'm running for school board. She got elected to the school board with a total of 35 votes. In a town of 40,000, there were 35 votes cast, and she got the majority of those votes, was on the school board. That's not even as good as Riceville, Iowa. A farmer in Riceville, Iowa said, you're sure not doing this in our school. He ran for school board. Turned out that on election day, he got busy. He did not get to vote on election day, and don't think he lost by one vote. That's not the story. The story is not a single person voted in the school board election. If he had voted for himself, he would be sitting on the school board just by voting for himself. See, this is local stuff. This is not where the attention is. This is where all the change comes from. It's where all the change is made. It's that local focus. Benjamin Rush, I talked about him earlier. He's called the father of public schools under the Constitution because in 1791, he did this piece. He said, we used to be 13 nations, now we're one nation with 13 states. What do we need to be teaching our schools if we're going to stay a nation? He said the purpose of public education is threefold. He said the number one purpose of public schools is to teach students to love and serve God. He said the number two purpose of public schools is to teach students to love and serve their country. He said the number three purpose of public schools is to teach students to love and serve their family. Now, if you look at that, most Christians I know would say, no, I don't think so. I think family is really more important than country. It should be God, it should be family, it should be country. And Benjamin said, no, you're wrong. It should be God, it should be country, and it should be family. And he explained, he said, if you ever lose control of your country, it will become the great enemy to your family. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. We've been so busy in our family, we've given up all the power centers, and that's why people are looking now and saying, you're doing what at school? I mean, we saw Loudoun County and Fairfax in the last 3 years. People are saying, what are you teaching my kids? And it turns out that so much of the cesspool of America has come out of the schools. That's why so many people are running for school board. So there's something good going on. I'm going to kind of close with some local results, just showing you, encourage you on how the church has been key. It's been salt and light for centuries until now. We've kind of let them talk us out of what we used to do historically. But if you look, let me just take you to Virginia real quickly. If you remember 2 years ago, Northrop passed a bill in Virginia that said if you abort a baby and the baby lives, it's okay to go ahead and let the baby die after it's born. That's all right. That a standing ovation in the legislature. Then in January, a new guy gets elected, Youngkin, who is opposite to that in every single way. As a matter of fact, he, at his own inauguration, ministers were concerned because he didn't have a prayer on the program. He led his own prayer, led it in Jesus' name there in the state capitol, grabbed the lieutenant governor's hand and her husband and the AG's hand and his wife and led it in Jesus' name. That's the way he's governed as well. He's been a very God-centric guy. Significantly, what happened is Faith Winds, you'll hear more about them this afternoon, but Faith Winds went in and found 312 churches in Virginia, none of them mega churches, just average community churches. And those 312, and there's tens of thousands of churches in Virginia, but these 312, they said, guys, we want you to look in your churches and just find people in your church, biblical people who have never before registered and never before voted, and just get them registered and get them to vote in the governor's election. And they got 77,000 people who had never before voted to vote in the governor's election. Youngkin won by 65,000 votes. 77,000 came out of those 312 churches. And that's only a small percentage of churches in Virginia. And they said, and by the way, 2 Timothy 2:5 says you can't be crowned unless you run according to the rules. What are the rules of elections? Don't have a clue. Maybe we ought to learn. 1,343 people out of those churches got involved in election integrity. They said, we want to be poll watchers. 300 of them were trained by the state as state-certified election officials. 1,043 were poll watchers. That group, 1,343, found 5.2% of the ballots as being fraudulent. They found one guy who had registered to vote in 27 locations. They found a cow pasture where 17 people voted out of the cow pasture, not even a house there. I mean, 5.2%, take that off the table. That's another election win for you right there, just in what the churches did. And then on top of that, they said, you know, we rural people out here in the country that have a brain. Northern Virginia, they've lost their mind. They work for Washington, D.C. We in the country are going to have to turn out at a higher level than we normally turn out. We got to run up the score out here in the country. The rural turnout, instead of being 35%, which was normal, it went up to 64% in the rural turnout. See, churches is what happened there. The same thing was going on. We've been working with 1,500 churches in Colorado. Took dozens and scores of school board elections in Colorado last November. Matter of fact, let me just give some quick headlines. It's kind of fun to look across the nation. Kansas posting critical race theory, COVID-19 mandates win Minnesota school board races. By the way, the media right now doesn't like saying Christian candidates. That's too dignified. They call us anti-CRT, anti-COVID-19. Because they love COVID-19, they love CRT. So that's us. So, but Minnesota, Christians won Minnesota school board races? Yeah, Jersey. I love this one in Jersey. A 19-year-old who saw his senior year disrupted by COVID shutdowns unseats the incumbent in the school board race. So this kid ran against the incumbent and beat him by 17 points, and it is really nice to finally have an adult on the school board in New Jersey. It's just kind of fun. Christians, we took the school board in Denver. Denver is really liberal, crazy, wacky, progressive blue. We took the school board in Denver. Same thing in Wichita. Wichita is the second most liberal city in Kansas. Kansas City, Wichita. Same in Treasure Valley, which is Boise. By far the most liberal city in Idaho is Boise. Same thing happened in Dallas. 51 churches got together. There were 15 open school board positions. They won all 15 school board positions, won them all by 60-40 margin, most of them by 70-30 margins. Colorado Springs, 4 school boards there. We took all 4 school boards, flipped them all in one election. Houston, we got churches involved in Houston. We have the school board in Houston, 2.3 million people in Houston. I mean, this is going on all over the United States, and it's local stuff, and this is where you get healthy, is from the local level. So I encourage you, I'll close with this challenge that Charles Finney gives. Finney, great revivalist involved in the Second Great Awakening. He wrote a book on how to have revivals. This is what he said as part of having a revival. He said the church must take right ground in regard to politics. He said politics are part of a religion in a country such as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. It's a stewardship country. God's put us in charge. He said, you guys take care of it till I come back. He said, God will bless or curse this nation according to the course that Christians take in politics. We've got to get involved locally. We've got to get outside our normal customary habits. We've got to get people thinking biblically. God bless you guys.